The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Following his long-standing participation on the Energy Council of Canada's Board of Directors, Jacob Irving became the organization's president in January of 2018. His nearly 20-year career in the Canadian energy industry has been divided almost evenly between the petroleum and electricity sectors. He has spent more than half of his time successfully leading prominent energy industry associations, including the Oil Sands Developers Group and the Canadian Hydropower Association. Now let's get into the episode with Jacob. Welcome back, Dave and John.
It's really good to be back.
Yes, nice to be here this morning and with our guest. Looking forward to Jacob talking to us.
Yep. Today we're joined by Jacob Irving, President and CEO at the Energy Council of Canada. Welcome, Jacob.
Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And today, John's going to get us kicked off into our episode, so I'll pass it over to you.
I am. I'm going to start off with a sort of question to hopefully place things. We hear lots of names of different bodies and everything else, and we're never quite sure what they mean. Sometimes they're for something, sometimes they're against it, despite what they're called. I'm not familiar with the Energy Council of Canada, and I don't know how many of our local listeners are familiar with it. So could you tell us, what is the Energy Council of Canada, overview of what it does, and interestingly, because I know our listeners are interested in this, who you're funded by?
No problem. John, David, nice to see you this morning. You too, Lysandra. And thanks for the opportunity to explain a little bit about the Energy Council of Canada. We are, I would probably describe ourselves as a convening body. We are technology neutral. We're nonpartisan. We're not for profit. We are funded by Government of Canada, the National Energy Ministry, Natural Resources Canada, is actually our founding member. They created our organization back in 1984, but we also have industry representation and we have cross-sectoral industry representation. So meaning that we have members from the oil and gas industry, the electricity, renewables, nuclear, basically anything that Canada is involved in, we have representation from those sectors. And as you probably know, when it comes to energy, we're involved in pretty much everything in this country. So I often say that in my position, I get to be radically neutral. And positive. I get positively neutral. If you can say such a thing in electricity context, I'm not sure, but we're positively neutral in the fact that, Canada has interests in all different forms of energy. And really, in many ways, the competition between those different forms of energy benefits Canadians. I like to say that, when it comes to the energy future, we've got a chip on every square. And if you're going to gamble, that is the safest way to gamble, to have a chip on every square. And so we have leadership positions in each of those areas. And we also follow in those areas where it's productive and it's advisable. So one thing maybe to mention is we're not a lobbying organization. I think a lot of organizations that you're used to in the energy space are formed by industry interests in order to promote or their particular technology, which is fine, which is great. Many of them are actually members with us at the Energy Council of Canada. But again, our group is a neutral, positive, convening organization that doesn't try to tell governments what to do, but instead tries to inform opinion. I hope that helps.
It certainly does, and it's good to get the funding one, because we may joke about it, but in the energy and climate change space, there are many bodies that appear to be one thing, but when you look under the covers, that they are funded by a particular interest group or whatever. And you answered part of my second question, is what scopes of energy, and you've basically covered that with, I like your expression, you've got a chip on every square. But what perhaps it might help, do you have a mission statement? What is it that the Energy Council wants to achieve? I mean, what does success look like for you?
I should probably know this off by heart, but if you go to our website, you can find it formally written. But it is essentially to develop an energy system that is for the benefit of Canadians, that is also both environmentally sustainable and responsible. So one that an energy system that meets our basic energy needs. I mean, you think about Canada. We go like right now where I live. We're having a plus 30-degree day here in summertime, and a few months from now, not too long from now, I know it'll be minus 30 degrees. So energy in Canada really is a matter of life and death. We should be good at it in many ways. If you, we have to be good at it, and so it really is important that we talk about it and that we learn from each other. That that we benefit from the competition between the different sources. I think that is actually part of Canada's energy strategy, to have all those different chips and all those different squares competing against each other to provide choice and energy security and energy equity to Canadians. It seems to work for us. When you look at our international rankings, we actually rank very highly in those particular dimensions. We're ranked number one in some cases in terms of energy security and energy equity. Not only do we have a good, strong, stable supply of energy for ourselves, but we're also pretty good. Not to toot our own horn, because us Canadians usually don't do that, but but we're also pretty good at getting access to energy to people, to some pretty remote and distant and far flung places across this second largest landmass that we inhabit. Extreme north, coastal regions, south, indigenous communities, more and more are making their own energy for themselves and are exporting it as well, and benefit and realizing their own energy futures within Canada. So we actually have a lot to share on the energy front. There's a former cabinet minister who used to put it, I like the way he put it, is that energy in Canada is the family business. We're good at all of it. We do all of it. And really, in many ways, our job is to try and break out of our shells somewhat and appear more on the international stage and talk about what we've learned, and really also to try and learn from others.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because so often we're hearing people that are, should we say, not technology agnostic and not positively neutral, and it's I'm trying to force almost binary solutions to things. You've got to be all of this, or you've got to do this. This is good, that's bad. So it's interesting hearing that. And I mean, I wonder what that holds for the future. And so I'm going to hand over to Dave for the next question, having established sort of what you are and where you are. Over to Dave.
Thank you, John. Jacob, for our listeners, they may not know that the energy industry is one of the largest impacts on our revenue, GNP, certainly for sure, the oil and gas sector, and the other kind of blessing that we have that maybe a lot of people outside Canada, maybe even Canadians, don't realize, that we have one of the cleanest grids in the world. And so we're very fortunate. I think you've described that. But things are changing, and they are going to change. Certainly that's a discussion. We're talking about this energy transition. But can you share with me, like, where do you see the energy industry going based on what you're involved in now in Canada? How are we evolving and modifying what we're doing?
It's an excellent question, because Canada is interested and should be very interested, should be foundational to this conversation that's happening. And it's funny, I actually think, not to make things personal, but I think about sort of the first half of my life and the second half of my life as a Canadian, as someone interested in energy. I mean, even as a kid, I would say that for the first half of my life, that the animating debate internationally on energy was the peak oil debate, right? This is where we were going to run out of oil and we were going to live in a Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome world, right?
Yeah.
And that, a new supply of it was incredibly important geopolitically, etc. And, us Canadians, we here on our landmass had something called the oil sands up north in northern Alberta. And, the deposit, it's the size of Florida, located in northern Alberta. It's well delineated. It's the thing about the oil sands, is that you don't have to go find it. It's almost like it's a giant oil deposit that just lives subsurface or it's a bitumen deposit to be really correct, but it's this bitumen deposit that lives subsurface up in northern Alberta. And the challenge was always, well, could you turn that stuff into oil? And if you could, boy, you could really relieve some of the supply pressures that the world is facing. And sort of in the 1960s, late 60s, we started working on it in earnest in Canada. And the federal government, the provincial government, and the industry all locked arms together to tackle this. It was like a moonshot. It was a project to see, could we separate this bitumen stuff from the sand? That's the first challenge. And then can you take this bitumen stuff and turn it into synthetic crude oil at an economic rate? So that, so that barrel would be competitive with the light sweet crude barrels that are being produced around the world. And we worked on it together, lockstep, for many years. And somewhere around 1996 was a magical year where technology and government policy came together to really unlock the oil sands. We found a different way of producing it that made it more economic. That was very important technologically. But then governments also got together, and the Alberta government adjusted its royalties. The federal government brought in some accelerated capital cost allowances, so some pretty intricate stuff. But it all came together to unlock the resource, and then a boom was on in the early 2000s. And I say all this because I was part of that. I lived in Fort McMurray during those early 2000 boom years. And I can remember the sense was, especially amongst all the engineers and everyone who devoted their lives to this challenge. I mean, they moved to northern Alberta and lived in Fort McMurray to try and realize this. The sense was, we'd accomplished this incredible thing, and that we were waiting to receive thank you cards for it. Right? But it was the early 2000s, and instead, we kind of started getting hate mail. Because the animating debate that would happen for the first half of my life, which was peak oil, had all of a sudden shifted to climate change. The animating global debate had changed. And it was all about greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gas emissions intensity. And here us Canadians we've just figured out how to make a new barrel of oil, except it's heavy on carbon. And that's what we're adding to the global energy mix. And I say that, in many ways, I feel like we were deer in the headlights. And I can say that because I was there. I was one of them. I headed up a group called the Oil Sands Developers Group at the time. And I felt like a deer in the headlights. We had all of these great arguments about new oil supply to help the rest of the world. And yet that's not what anybody seemed to want to talk about anymore. And so then from there, the shift was on. And that's sort of the second half of my life. The second half of our energy existence in Canada has been, realizing that is the debate and trying to address it and trying to change things around to meet it. So it's interesting where we've come from and where we're going. But the one thing that I like to say, and I'm quite serious about it when I do, is that throughout it with Canada and the way that we develop energy, it's important to recognize, to notice that we are a responsible energy producer because we are a responsive energy producer. What I mean by that is that, we're a young country, but we are an old and sophisticated democracy. We've only been around since 1867, but we've been an uninterrupted democracy since then. And it means that development, economic activity happens within the context of democratic controls. And so we must develop our resources in a way that fits the needs, fits the expectations of our population. And I'd also say that I think that we're also very sensitive and responsive to international pressure as well. It's not just our people who have a say in the way that our resources are developed. The rest of the world does too. And they bring that pressure to bear through investment decisions, through choices they make in purchasing. In many ways, I say that, Canada, I think we are a very customer service based kind of country. And what we're trying to do is figure out energy products that the world wants and needs to buy. And anyway, that's why I'm excited to actually be part of this. So, sorry, it's a bit of a long answer, but it's funny because it does tap on personal history and also sort of Canadian energy.
Well, I think what you've shared too to the audience and to ourselves is, you had this number of years of people that just threw their, like you said, they just did everything they could to get oil from the oil sands. And so they were like, gave everything. And then all of a sudden the switch gets changed. And then all of a sudden, well, what the heck are you guys doing? It would be difficult. Like growing up, learning that's what you're doing. And then all of a sudden, what the heck are you guys? It would be a hard psychological issue if you're in that particular jurisdiction. So I've, as you know, have been in Alberta, I understand that issue. So, but now the world, as you just described, is decarbonizing. So how do you see the energy industry? And by the way, that means electrical, gas, oil, diesel. How do you see that changing in Canada going forward?
Yeah, I think that Canada, again, is smart to keep a chip on every square and to work on every different energy facet to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that's when I talk about energy, I usually try to be very scrupulous in talking about lesser GHG emissions, not less emitting, because in some ways there isn't really any such thing as non-emitting energy. There's always a greenhouse gas profile associated to every form of energy. It's just who is the lowest and who is the highest. And us Canadians, again, we're involved in all of them. But if you look at the world primary consumption of energy, and when you do this kind of analysis, sometimes it can be a bit deflating and depressing. Other times it can be motivating. It can stimulate you to see the need for change. But the world, really, last I checked, primary energy is about 85% fossil fuel. And it's about 15% non-emitting electricity, give or take a percentage here or there. That's pretty big when you think about the challenge. When you look at Canada, we're a little bit better in that 65% of our primary energy is met by fossil fuels, and 36% is met by non-emitting or less emitting, I always like to say less emitting electricity. Again, we're very blessed in Canada in that we have hydropower strength. The second part of my career, I went from the oil and gas industry. I headed up the Canadian Hydropower Association. So I like to say, in my estimation, two of the great energy pillars of Canada are the oil sands and hydropower. Not least of all because they are two things that we have that many other countries just simply don't. And so it behooves us to think about that in the way that we do things. But it does allow us to have a slightly higher percentage in electricity. Now, the challenge that a lot of people talk about, and you guys have both alluded to it, John and Dave, is that people say, well, okay, what we need to do is we need to switch to a higher percentage of electricity as primary energy. We've got to flip the script. It can't be 85% fossil anymore and 15% electricity. It's got to be maybe more 50-50. Or maybe even electricity should become the dominant one because there are more non-emitting ways to make electricity. Certainly in the Canadian context, that's the case. You guys mentioned earlier, we have one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world. 80% less emitting or non-emitting, people will say, but about 65 in hydro. Then the next big chunk comes from nuclear. And then after that, the new renewables that have been growing and coming on more and more in Canada too. The new renewables I call wind and solar coming on more and more. But, another way to look at it is that big, huge fossil chunk that dominates the world and is still more than 50% here in Canada. We need to look at decarbonizing that as well. And because it doesn't feel like it's going away. When you look at the world totals, I've heard, people talk about our reliance on coal as a planet over the last 20 years has gone down by about 1%. Our reliance on oil has been gone down by something around 4%. And again, I think about my life, the last 20 years, I think about when, the second half of my career was all about climate change. You think about the heavy awareness that we've seen over the last 20 years. You think about the acceptance of climate change as an issue, the need to deal with it. And we've managed to bring down our reliance on coal by 1% and oil by about 4%. something there says, well, maybe we need to work on making those forms of energy less emitting rather than trying to fully replace them with electrification, because that's a tall order. And anyway, it's great to talk to you guys about this sort of thing.
Just to follow up on that, Jacob, and thank you for sharing those statistics about the status, because I think, again, most people generally don't really understand or appreciate, or as John indicated in the past, people will use energy, but they just pay their bills. They don't really look at it or understand it. But I want to come back to what I've just said. So it's my personal belief that Canadians are we're leaders in many capacities. Like, we're great at the supply side, like whether it's oil, gas, electricity. But what do you think as end users? Could the end users play a more pertinent role in helping us decarbonize going forward? Do you see that playing a factor going forward? So, where to be specific, like large industries, we work with them. Sometimes they look at energy, they talk about energy, but it just seems like it's an overhead cost that they don't focus on because it's just, we take it for granted because we have supply. Do you think there would be some validity for more end users to be more involved and taking accountability on their self, to be focusing on this to help out in decarbonization?
Yeah, I think it would. It's interesting. You look at Canada and our electricity supply. I mean, there are provinces that have essentially 100% non-emitting renewable electricity. Many of them are the hydropower provinces, but Ontario has a pretty strong claim in that regard as well. It's getting more electricity from fossil fuels now than it was recently, but still has a very non-emitting grid compared to many other jurisdictions, provinces, countries in the world. But you look at Quebec, 100% hydropower, BC close to 100%, Newfoundland, Manitoba for sure. And the question that you can ask a little bit of some of the large manufacturers and developers out there is, if you take your emissions seriously, and if that is a key consideration for you in making your product and selling it to consumers so that they can feel good or they can feel like they're part of the solution, why not more manufacturing and setup in Canada? I think it should be a compelling argument. But what's interesting is that it feels like that we are rounding a corner on some of that. I mean, if you look at Quebec, for example, there's a live debate that has gone on in Quebec with its hydropower as to whether or not it should export its power to the United States to help clean up that grid, because that grid is much more emitting and needs much more assistance than Quebec's does. Or should it use that power domestically to attract industry and create jobs, grow the population of the province? I think nice dilemmas to have. When you think about it, I mean, in Canada, I have to step back every so often. And, some of our energy debates and dilemmas are actually about managing good news. It's sort of, when it comes to energy, sometimes it's like managing an embarrassment of riches. We should be good at this. I think we have to be good at this because we have all the different choices at our fingertips. But I mean, even in Quebec, when you look at primary energy consumption is still fossil fuel. Even though it is one of the world's capitals of clean electricity, it still relies on fossil fuels and transportation and heating and everything else the way the rest of the world does. So one of its approaches, of course, is trying to develop a leadership stake in electric vehicles. And arguably it has some of the best charging infrastructure in Canada. It really takes the approach seriously. And you think about it, and the reason why is because in Quebec, the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions is transportation.
Yeah.
Right? Because the electricity system is 100%, almost 100% hydropower. So anything, and it's interesting to think about that too, because when you look around the rest of the world, compared to the rest of the world, the general number one source of greenhouse gas emissions for the world is electricity generation through the burning of coal.
Right.
That is number one source by a country mile. In Canada, that is about the number 5 source of emissions. Again, talking about the grid and the way that so we have a very clean electricity grid. And I would say, when it comes to electric vehicles, Canada in many ways should be supremely interested, should be very involved, because we have the grid that you can drive these vehicles on very cleanly.
Agree. I just want to make one comment just to reinforce what you're saying. So we have been approached by a European company to create more production here in Canada for the worldwide market because of our grid. So you'll be pleased to hear, we're a small organization, but that is starting to happen. At least we're hearing that from people that we're talking to, that people are looking to come to Canada for that reason, for manufacturing.
I mean, I think that's key. I think that's maybe the missing part of the puzzle, has been connecting consumers with their choices and the like. I mean, I think there's, a lot of companies that can, in the past have got good PR value by talking about a renewable project that they invested in and that they've done. But then when you look at their overall profile, you see that it's actually not a big part of what they do, and that it, not to be cynical, but it's been done for PR value, and consumers will turn to that product and think that they're doing the world a good. They think that they're making responsible choices, but meanwhile, there's not a lot of fire held to the feet of some of those manufacturers and producers. And so I think that's the next big change, is linking consumers with it and that letting them have the choice. There's an anecdote I like to tell about electric vehicles in Canada. And it was funny, I was on a webinar with about 20 other energy leaders from across Canada. Great people, really know their stuff, strong in their knowledge. And we were talking about energy transition, and everybody, of course, was talking about electric vehicles, because the number one source of greenhouse gas emissions for Canada, it's often a tie between our production of oil and gas, our upstream production of oil and gas, but then also transportation.
Yeah,
is kind of, they're like tied, neck and neck, to see which one produces more GHGs. And so transportation is a huge area for us to look into, and we should be looking at. Anyway, we were all on the call, and we were all sort of preaching to each other about electric vehicles. 20 of us, and all sort of one-upping each other with the stats and the promise and everything else. And then somebody on the call asked the question, who here owns an electric vehicle? And no one, including myself, owned an electric vehicle, right? And, and I say this, I pre-admit it, is that, and I don't own an electric vehicle, and I've wanted to own one for about 12 years. And I can bore you with all the reasons as to why I don't. I mean, they're very, personal and all the like. But, the fact remains that I don't. And so I think that's, as much as anything, a bit of a wake-up call in terms of what needs to be done to enable. Because, I mean, you look at Canada and you would think, wow, this is a country that's just ripe for electric vehicles with its electricity grid. Not only is it clean and renewable, but it has a lot of potential. We have not tapped out our potential to produce this kind of electricity. We have many different options that we can turn to. And yet, when you start looking into it, I mean, there are a lot of small details that add up together that hold it back.
Totally agree. And it's almost another podcast talking about what needs to be done on the infrastructure to allow that to happen. But
and probably with somebody who's even more expert than myself on it, because I mean, I think off the top, I mean, charging infrastructure is an impediment difficulty. The size of our market is one of the things that affects us. I mean, we've only got 40 million people stretched across the second largest landmass on Earth.
Right.
We're a tough market to serve, and we actually only have so much say or sway with the number of vehicles that we can buy.
Right.
Anyway, there's many reasons.
Right.
Yeah, to add to that, I recently purchased a vehicle, and my goal was to purchase a hybrid, but the wait for one was about 16 months. So I My drive to work is 3 kilometers. My work has a charging infrastructure. However, there was no supply for me to purchase a vehicle that I wanted. So I know a lot of people are struggling with that currently, and hopefully once the supply chain catches up, we can all get those hybrid and electric vehicles that we want.
You're so right. I mean, all of the great plans and different visions and ideas. I mean, throw a global pandemic into it, followed by a massive rise in inflation, unlike we've seen in 20 years, and supply chain issues. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why a lot of what we know we should be doing and what we'd like to do doesn't happen in reality. And I do think actually we do need to take a bit of a break on each other and ourselves for that. But at the same time, we've got to look toward multiple solutions. The idea is, there's no silver bullet, there's silver buckshot that we've got to use in this. And in the Canadian perspective, yes, we should be moving more to using clean, renewable electricity because we have it and we can do it. But also our fossil fuels, we have the potential to decarbonize those and lead in that direction as well. And so my view is let's just lead on all of it.
Well, to end off this episode, Jacob, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think maybe one of the biggest takeaways from the listeners is that Canada is actually really big in energy, is really good at energy, and that it is a responsible producer because it's a responsive producer. We develop energy both privately and publicly, and we are as transparent, if not more transparent, than many other energy producing countries on the planet. And in many ways, we are a customer service based country. We will produce what people buy, what people want, what people demand, and we will change. I think of it, it's a big challenge for us is just to let the world know that we exist and that we can help. Really, again, I think about the first half of my career, my first half of my life in energy. And the way I put it often is that, we didn't necessarily promote ourselves on the energy front outside our borders that much because we had a dependent customer in the United States of America. Basically, we would make as much energy as they could take. They would take as much energy as we could make. There wasn't really a whole reason to advertise. But in 2023, it's the reason why we entered into a free trade agreement, I would contend. Back the original free trade agreement, one of the first global free trade agreements in the world, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. A lot of that was predicated on Canadian oil and the US need for it. Well, in 2023, that's not the case anymore. The United States is actually a competitor on the global scene when it comes to energy. And it's good. They're a good competitor to have. The world, I think, actually benefits from having Canada and the U.S. competing in energy. But we have to become more competitive. We have to secure our markets in the United States and grow them to the extent that we can. But we've also got to start looking at other countries around the world and helping to supply their energy needs. It's not to be trite, but it's the old Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. And in energy, Canada has great power. But anyway, I look at our track record and I look at our responsiveness and I know that we're more than up for the challenge.
Thanks, Jacob. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
Well, it's interesting that there's quite a few takeaways from there. And I must admit, as a non-Canadian, two comments. One, I do understand the Canadian modesty, and there's often been jokes about it, and I do get that. But I think it was interesting.
John, I'm sorry.
I mean, there was a British comedian talked about going to stay in Toronto, and that the hotel reception didn't happen to mention that the CN Tower was one of the tallest structures in the world, and comments like that. But there were a few things you said that sort of resonated with me. I particularly like your policy one of having a chip on every square. But I was smiling when you talked that there was a magical year when technology and policy coincided. And I think my takeaway is we need a few more magical years.
Agreed. And that kind of steadfast relationship and consistency in relationship between orders of government and industry toward achieving a common aim. Right now, there's a lot of talk with the Oil Sands Pathways group is interesting to look into. This is a group that I think has understood the arguments and is changing their approach. And very much they're interested in carbon capture, use, and sequestration to help drive down the emissions profile of our fossil fuels in Canada. And actually, when Fatty Birol came to visit us, the executive director of the energy, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, somebody asked him if there was one thing that Canada should focus on in the world of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. If it could only focus on one thing to the exclusion of all others, what should that thing be? And his advice was carbon capture, use, and sequestration. Because we have the fossil fuel resource, but we also have the geology to do it. And we also have a regime, a mineral regime that allows it to be done a little bit more efficiently and easily. So, we're full of solutions. And so we should be optimistic.
Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
The point that we're really hedged in every energy piece. I think as a person that looks at financial pieces and how to grow, hedging and being good and trying to strive to be better in every capacity, I think is really, really important. I think we've talked many times about our modesty and that we don't actually convey how good we are in these different things. I think that needs to be out there because there's an opportunity to export our expertise. And then the last thing, which I think customer base should start being just as good about energy as the supply side. I actually think the end use customer needs to be more involved. I think we could even be even more powerful as a nation if we undertook that as well.
Agreed, because again, I think that Canada, I often say we're a customer service based country. We will provide what the market demands. And getting clarity between the consumer and energy end use is tough. We know it to be true. But there's a desire out there and a willingness, apparently, and we have made progress on this front. So I think there'll be more.
Dave, Jacob, John, thank you for your time.
It's been good. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much, Jacob. Really appreciate it.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.